We've talked already a little bit about flushing, which sounds a bit strange, but in this episode we're going to talk about what it means to call deps.flush, or to schedule a flush in more detail. Flushing allows us to run some code at a later time, so to get a more intuitive sense of what's going on, you can think of a flush as calling setTimeout and having it execute on the next tick of the event loop. So I'll just put a console.log inside of this setTimeout. And what will happen is if we put some code before the setTimeout or the flush, and then I put some code after, what we'll see here is that before flush prints, and then after prints, and then later the next flush prints to the console. And so what's happened here is this line of code executes and we print this out to the console. And then this gets queued up and gets ready to execute on the next event loop tick. And then console log after gets executed. And so we actually print out after first. And then on the next tick, we print out next flush. And so this should give you a more intuitive sense of what it means to flush. Okay, I've changed up the code a little bit so that we can look at an actual example. I have a print name function that grabs the name from session and then prints it to the console. And so if we call this print name function inside of deps.autorun, it becomes reactive. And so if the value of name changes, the function will run again. Then I've created a helper function down here called setName, and that's what we'll be using to set the name of the session value. So over in the console, let's call setName. And when we do that, you see an interesting result. The setNameTo string that we print here gets printed to the console first. So you might expect that as soon as we call set, this function gets run again immediately and we should see name and then the new name printed, but it doesn't. First, this line gets executed. And that's because the function printName is not rerun until the next tick of the event loop, or after the next flush, or during the next flush. So what we see here is that setNameTo name string gets printed first. And then on the next tick, we rerun the printName function and then print out the name and then the new value. Now let's say we wanted to force the flush to happen immediately. It'll automatically be scheduled to happen on the next tick of the event loop, but let's just say that we wanted to rerun the printName function immediately. To do that, we could say deps.flush. And then over in the console, let's call setName, and we'll set it to another name. Now this time what you're seeing is we call setName and the printName function reruns right away. And then we see name colon and the new name printed to the console. And then after that, you see the setNameTo another name printed to the console. And that's because we forced the flush to happen right away instead of waiting until the next tick of the event loop. Now sometimes you'll see a function called afterFlush. And afterFlush takes a callback function as a parameter. And we could type in here afterFlush, and I'll get rid of the manual flush. So let's take a look at what this does. Sometimes it's useful to run some code after the flush has completed. And so when the flush happens, that's when our printName function will get rerun. And sometimes we want to run some code after that happens. For instance, the Meteor User Interface technologies uses deps to see if a value has changed and then to re-render some DOM elements. And sometimes you want to wait until that process is done, and when it is, then run some of your own code. And so you can use afterFlush for that purpose. So if we jump over to the debugger, and I call setName, and we'll just call it new name. What you can see here is the setNameTo console log prints first. And then on the next flush, the print name function gets rerun. And then after that process has completed, the after flush console log gets printed. So the important thing to remember is that code that runs inside of an after flush callback will run after our computations function has been rerun. And sometimes that can be useful in your applications. I've taken us over to the source code for deps flush. I found that sometimes in my own applications it's useful to go through this function and see how this works. For instance, you can see it that during a flush, the code grabs the pending computations that have been invalidated and then reruns each of those functions by calling the recompute method of the computation. And then after that's happened, it calls our after flush callbacks. So in this episode, we looked at the deps flush process. We looked at how flush works very similar to a set timeout. And we also saw how we can force a flush to happen immediately by calling deps.flush. Then we saw how we can add a callback to the after flush callbacks queue by calling deps.afterflush. And that code will run after our computations function has been rerun. And one last note, I found that it's easiest to get some intuition about how all of this stuff works if you just play with it in your browser and try different combinations and scenarios. So I highly recommend that you go into the browser and type deps.flush and try different scenarios.